to this webinar. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Aaron. I'm CodePink's War is Not Green campaigner and our East Coast regional organizer. So this webinar is the second webinar in our Disarming Earth Day series, which has sort of two different meanings that in terms of what it is to disarm the sort of traditional notions and disrupt the traditional notions of what it is to care for the earth and the sort of greenwash notions that erase a lot of different dynamics and key drivers of the climate crisis, that being warfare, militarism, imperialism. And so this series really is is an attempt to lift up our War is Not Green campaign, which is really CodePink's work to invite more unity between the climate justice and anti-war movements and movements against imperialism, colonialism, and militarism. The US military, if you're unaware, is the #1 institutional polluter in the world. We have over 800 military bases, some of what we'll be talking about tonight. And the destruction that our war-making causes around the world is really rooted in the US's quest since its birth and inception in its settler colonial context for extraction and dominance, and that being extraction and dominance over both people and land globally, over natural resources, over political and economic power. And so our war making to continue this extraction of oils, of minerals, and of people is really done through militarism, occupation, and of course, ongoing genocide in Palestine and many places around the world, which creates significant damage to ecosystems and around the world that sustain life, that sustain agriculture, and biodiversity that's needed for global survival. And so despite being one of the largest polluters, the Pentagon and militarism is often, unfortunately, an elephant in the room in climate spaces, often because it's not discussed due to political or funding-based red lines and leadership, often with huge bases of people that are really trying to work for the betterment of life, but for a number of reasons that we can get into in various conversations, is often not something that's discussed. And so this webinar series and this campaign is really an attempt to create a climate movement that is one that is also a movement against war and empire, because the fight against war and empire is the movement for the climate and for the earth and for the planet and for every part of it that is interconnected with one another. And so we just recently released an open letter that a lot of different organizations, including many of the ones on this call, signed on to, which is sort of a first step at inviting more unity between movements and to combine efforts to clarify sort of where we are amidst, of course, constantly shifting political climate and constant escalation, de-escalation shifts of where escalation is in the world. And so, there's been so many in the past few weeks and the past few days, tariffs that are part of the US trying to continue its global quest for dominance. The genocide in Palestine has continued and continued to escalate even more in increasingly horrific ways. The entire region of Syria, Lebanon, Yemen is being bombed, all of which with US-made bombs and green lighting, as well as just the actual bombing of it. And there's been increasing militarization in the Asia Pacific, a lot of which is part of an escalating Cold War against China, and continued extraction across the world in Africa, in the Congo, which we talked about a lot in the previous webinar. But of course, it's always extraction and exploitation for private accumulation and interests, and for the US's continued dominance and exploitation around the world. And so last week, we talked about a lot of this in our first teach-in, which was about land. We spoke with the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, with Anak Bayan USA, who represents the Philippines and a lot of the long history of US imperialism there that they continue to resist. We also spoke with an organizing representative from CodePink on the cost of war to Ukraine environmentally, as well as the Center for Research on the Congo, Kambale, who spoke a lot about the horrors of what this decades-long exploitation of the heart of Africa has caused to the land and the people there. And so this week we're moving from what these processes of war are, and occupation to the land, to more long-term fixtures of occupation of bases of military presence. And so just to very quickly wrap up and ground us in this, I think bases in a lot of ways are how the US maintains its around the world. And that's with our over 800 bases, each one serving various purposes. There's so many covert bases in Africa, West Asia, and including within the so-called US that always are extremely harmful for those communities. We also just did a deal in Ecuador to build a lot more bases. And so this is constantly expanding. And each of these bases can be used at any given point to launch weapons of war, for training, for bomb testing, that then those bombs are then used to murder people and the planet elsewhere, for political and capital accumulation based interests. And you can look all around the world at the different command centers: AFRICOM, Indo-Pacific Command, Central Command, CARICOM, SouthCom. And so we'll touch upon a lot of these tonight, but these bases are known to be catastrophic to the environment through chemicals like PFAS that have a lot of long-term health impacts, through fuel leakages, the seizure of indigenous land that protects so much of biodiversity, and agricultural practices that aren't necessary for sustaining life in all its forms. And of course, are all part of a significant portion of the military's carbon emissions that really show us the linkages between local destruction of the US military and its global destruction. So you can also join us next week for our next webinar that'll go over some more global dynamics. And the week after, that'll sort of sum up the thesis of the War is Not Green campaign and what it is to create an anti-militarist climate movement. So we'll get started. Our first speaker is going to be a pre-recorded speaker to sort of set a lot of this up. Our first speaker is David Vine, who is a political anthropologist and writer. David is the author of a trilogy of books about war and peace, including The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts, from Columbus to the Islamic State, which was a finalist for the 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. The other books are Island of Shame, The Secret History of the US Military Base on Diego Garcia, and Base Nation, How US Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. David was a professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. for 18 years, achieving the full rank of professor in 2018. And so I will share my screen of an interview that I did with David in preparation for this webinar from the other day. And if you have any issues hearing or seeing this, let me know. Cool. So hi, David. Thanks so much for being here and joining the webinar in a recorded format. US military bases, there's, I think, over 800 of them. I know that the numbers can sort of vary in calculations, and that's part of the insanity of its scope. But they are all over the world, and I think around 70 countries, make up a huge portion of the amount of military bases globally. So I was wondering if you could just sort of start us off by just talking a little bit about your work and research and the sort of basics of the general scope of US military bases and presence globally.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be talking to you, and I'm just sorry not to be part of the really important webinar. I've been studying military bases, US military bases, for almost 25 years, and indeed the number of bases has fluctuated across time, but it's safe to say that the United States currently has more foreign military bases, extraterritorial military bases, than any country, people, or empire in world history. And there have been even more. At the height of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, there were probably twice the number there are currently. And currently, indeed, there are upwards of 750, somewhere between 750 to 800 US military bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C. And indeed, this is far more than any other country. Britain has some foreign bases, France has some foreign bases, Russia has some in former Soviet republics and maybe still in Syria, an open question. China has a very small handful, some on human-made islands in the South China Sea, and one in Djibouti, where a few other countries have foreign bases. But if you put all the other countries together, combined, they have perhaps 150 to 200 foreign bases. So the US has somewhere between 75 and 85% of the world's foreign military bases currently. Indeed, in around 80 foreign countries and territories, colonies, really all over the world. Large concentrations especially remain and have been in place since World War II in Europe and Asia, but also large concentrations in the greater Middle East, as well as increasingly in the last 20, 25 years in parts of Africa. Also a smaller number in Latin America. But this is what the current infrastructure of bases looks like, and one should compare it to the diplomatic infrastructure that the United States has abroad. And there are somewhere around 275 US embassies, missions, and consulates, although President Trump seems to be closing some of those, further increasing the disparity when it comes to US foreign policy that has been so dominated by the military, by the Pentagon, for far, far too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just such a insane amount to wrap my head around, and I think for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And so, can you talk a little bit about sort of why we have so many, and sort of what the different purposes are that they serve, and what some of the interests are of all of it?
Yeah, we should be questioning every single US military base abroad and domestically for that matter, because any base that is unnecessary is a base that is, in the words of President Eisenhower, a kind of theft. It's a theft from money we could be spending to feed people, to house people, to provide universal health care, to take on global warming, global heating, climate change, when in fact the opposite, of course, is the case, that US military bases, whether they're abroad or domestically, are a major contributor to global warming, climate change, in addition to having a range of other really harmful environmental impacts. But why do we have all these bases? Largely, there's no good reason, but it's part of, in fact, there's a very bad reason. It's part of a larger strategy that's been in place since World War II to dominate the globe with US military power. This is the infrastructure of imperial domination. The United States has been, as an empire, defined by a collection of foreign military bases larger than that, as I mentioned, larger than that of any empire or people or country in world history. Bases have been a critical part of US leaders, so-called leaders, efforts to control the rest of the globe and keep them in a political and economic system that has benefited largely a bunch of corporations, war profiteers, and other powerful people. These bases themselves, of course, earn large profits for the corporations that help build them and run them. The cost of 750 to 800 bases abroad is somewhere around $66 billion a year, $66 billion a year just to maintain them. If you add the troops that are on them, we get somewhere close to $100 billion a year. And that's larger than almost every federal government budget, federal government agency budget. It's a massive amount of money building a robust infrastructure, while so much of our domestic infrastructure is, of course, crumbling.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And so, this is part of our Earth Month programming, where we're sort of calling attention to the fact that the US military is one of the largest polluters in the world, the largest institutional polluter, and that US bases make up a significant part of that, both sort of locally and globally. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more sort of about that environmental, agricultural, cultural, political impact and sort of the linkages between those.
Sure. Yeah, indeed. U.S. bases are a major part of the overall carbon footprint of the U.S. military, which, as you alluded to, the U.S. military is the largest institutional contributor to climate change, global warming, global heating on Earth. And bases, along with training for war, as well as war itself and the production of weapons, are the major components that are fueling global warming, climate change when it comes to the US military. And indeed, I neglected to emphasize the way in which this infrastructure of bases is, of course, an infrastructure for war. It has made the endless wars that the United States has been fighting since 2001 and in many ways since World War II has made those wars possible. And those wars, of course, have horrific environmental impacts and include, in addition to, of course, their human impacts, the deaths, the destruction, the injuries. But bases, whether indirectly part of US wars or not, have terrible environmental impacts, as do all military bases, regardless of which country controls it. Bases like war are not good for children and other living things, as the famous saying goes. When we just need to think about what bases are, there are, of course, concentrations of high-powered weaponry, hazardous materials, chemicals, fuel, petroleum, oil, things that are not good for the environment. And the US military has a long record of damaging local environments around bases. Camp Lejeune, many people in the United States might be aware of. There are large lawsuits underway because of damage inflicted on the local environment and on local people by the base. The same has been true at bases around the world, although especially in places that have relatively little political power. Places like Okinawa, which is itself a colonized part of Japan, doubly colonized by the United States, where Agent Orange and all sorts of environmental damage has been found to have taken place, South Korea, but also I would want to call our attention to places like Hawaii, which I think you'll be hearing about later, as well as Guam and Puerto Rico, many parts of Puerto Rico, but especially Vieques, which was really large parts of which were decimated by US military training.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have any sort of calls to action or things that you want to sort of put forth as ways to sort of take action against these bases or sort of build an anti-militarist climate movement?
I really do. Well, I think when it comes to the climate movement, I think we have to be really clear that and take on the elephant in the room of climate change, global warming. Then that is war, and the U.S. military in particular, but other militaries as well, are major contributors to global warming, climate change, and have been largely ignored. When it comes to bases, I think the Camp Lejeune example, and then examples of environmental damage from elsewhere, signals, and this is not my idea, this is an idea I've talked about with others, signals the opportunity to build not just solidarity, but political connections between people living around US bases domestically and abroad around the world, to create a movement to repair environmental damage caused by bases, and in many cases, to close the bases entirely. So I think there is this real opportunity to use environmental damage in a positive way to build connections and build a movement between people living around bases in many parts of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here and for all. Thank you so much to David for that and sending love to and appreciation for that. So we're going to move on to our first live speaker and focusing on sort of the specific organizing of the Oahu Water Protectors with Hialani Sonoda Pale, who is a Kanaka Maoli community leader and lead community organizer with the Oahu Water Protectors, an organization which successfully called for the shutdown and defueling of the Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, which poisoned 93,000 Oahu residents in 2021. For her efforts protecting Oahu's water, she was recognized as a quote unquote hero by the Hawaii State House of Representatives in 2022. She's an important voice in the indigenous Hawaiian peaceful struggle for liberation, decolonization, and land back. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. Mahalo nui for everyone attending. So I'm just going to get right into it. My name is Heleni Sonoda Pale. I am Kanaka Maoli. I was born and raised on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. I can trace my genealogy back to time immemorial, and in fact, I can trace my genealogy back to this land and back to Sky Father and Earth Mother. I have a kuleana responsibility as a Native and Indigenous person of Hawaii to protect that which is most precious, our land, water, and our way of life. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of history with in terms of Hawaiians, and then kind of talk about a few of the different things that we're dealing with here in Hawaii, especially on Oahu. Oahu is the most populated island in Hawaii. Most of the 1.4 million people that live here live on Oahu. So in 1893, the U.S. military invaded Hawaii, overthrew our beloved queen, our peaceful Hawaiian nation, under the false pretense of protecting American lives, when, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. For 132 years, Hawaii has been under illegal occupation. We have been the victims of egregious harms that has been done not just to ourselves, but to our land, our water, and to our fragile ecosystems. We are known throughout the world as the endangered species capital of the world, and for good reason. We're 2,000 miles away from the nearest continental landmass. We are also because of our location in the middle of Oceania, or the Pacific Ocean. We are also the kind of like the epicenter, or the control center, or command center for the U.S. military in Oceania. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is located here on Oahu, in Camp Smith, and it's from here that the U.S. military actually controls, like a big web, the Pacific. I want to talk a little bit about RIMPAC. So RIMPAC exercises happen, I think, every couple years. But I want to refer to the Tongan professor, Peli Hau'ofa, who wrote an essay entitled Our Sea of Islands back in 1994. And this essay was really important to Indigenous peoples across Oceania, because what it does is it shifts our perspective of who we are and our connections with each other. Our collective struggle in Oceania has, morphed, but I think this was one of the most important essays. And he talks about how we are a sea of islands. A lot of the narrative, the colonial narrative for over 100 years has been, we are small islands in the middle of the Pacific without any power to change our destiny or to change our future. And I think when he wrote that article in 1994, it really shifted our understanding. And with FESPAC, this past FESPAC that was held here in Oahu, that was one of the themes of FESPAC, where thousands of Pacific Islanders gathered and celebrated who we are as a people. Um, and I think, and also I want to say, as an Indigenous person and as a community organizer with the Oahu Water Protector, what motivates us, and as Indigenous peoples and as organizers and water protectors, is love, and what we want to, love for humanity, nature, our world, and the future generations. So, bit about RIMPAC. So, RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific, is the world's largest international marine maritime exercise that takes place every 2 years on our land and in our ocean, in Oceania. These are war games that are conducted in order to bring death and destruction to indigenous peoples around the world. Um, so these maritime exercises, are just not they're not just harmful to here us here in Hawaii or to our relatives in the ocean, our marine relatives, but also to the world, because this is where they learn how to increase their lethality. Um, Ipeli writes, we are the sea, we are the ocean. And as an indigenous person and as in solidarity with other indigenous peoples across Oceania, we believe we are the sea, we are the moana, and we have a familial relationship with everything in the ocean, with all living life, the sky, the plants, the animals. And when we are protecting our islands and our vai and our people, we are also protecting our familial relations in our Oceania. The motivation for RIMPAC is, to increase their ability. It's like a showcase of weapons. Basically, they're sinking ships in the middle of the ocean, and they actually they actually apply for a NEPA permit so that they can actually uh say they actually have to report how many whales, how many dolphins, how many species that they are going to kill and harm in the process of doing these RIMPAC games. And later on I have an action call for that too as well. But so there's 29 countries that convene, and this past RIMPAC, which happened last summer, uh also meant that we were um, you know, going to host Israel. So the 29 countries convened last summer, and when they convene, they come here to Oahu. We're the kind of like the staging area. And so we did have a huge protest against that, against the US hosting this, and again, waging this whole genocidal exercise, and against Israel coming onto our shores. We're definitely opposed as indigenous peoples in solidarity with Palestine to Israel coming here to Hawaii to train and to increase their lethality so that they can commit genocide against the Palestinians. Um, as the largest institutional greenhouse gas producer in the world, the US military is the main contributor, of course, and the driving force behind global warming, rising seas, and disappearing islands. We are on the front line in Oceania of that struggle as well, because our island, Oahu, is literally falling into the ocean. There are islands in Micronesia that are disappearing. And so that struggle against that our anti-militarization struggle is not just a struggle, a political one. It's about actually survival for our islands as well. Okay, and RIMPAC is literally just about flexing the colonial imperial might of countries who wanna still, um, have us be in this box of being small and insignificant, to live fearfully in the world. Um, that's what RIMPAC is. It's about them flexing. It's a power trip. It's totally unnecessary. There is no threat. And we are being fed here in Hawaii the threat of China. That's what is being fed here in Hawaii. That's the whole narrative, that China is the threat, and that's why the US military um uh needs this foothold, right? We're strategically located in the middle of the Pacific. Um and what is very clear is that this is not really about national security, because domestically the US military has poisoned their own people. And that is not just Red Hill, but again, Camp Lejeune and other bases across the US. Okay, Um, okay, and I want to just talk about another topic, something that's going on here in Hawaii is the leases. So right now on Oahu, the U.S. military controls about 23% of our island, and um, their leases for 30,000 acres of stolen Hawaiian Kingdom Crown and government lands. These are Hawaiian lands, national lands that were stolen, are up in 2029. Um, and again, these lands are being ours, and it's Hawaiian lands, it's indigenous lands that are being used for footholds and training grounds for the US to maintain their control of Hawaii and its geopolitical position in Oceania. But I want to just say that here in Hawaii, we have a long history of opposition, of struggle against the US military. In 1976, a group of Aloha Aina or Hawaiian uh, protectors, land and water protectors, went onto Kaho'olawe, landed, and was able to stop the bombing of an island that is now deemed uninhabitable because it was bombed so much. We our people, this is a grassroots struggle, um, stopped the bombing in Makua Valley in 2004. We won a lawsuit in 2019. And then, of course, and the lawsuit was to stop the renewal of leases for Pohakuloa. For Red Hill, that was a that was something that was the most recent victory for the people here in Hawaii. And I want to just really say that it wasn't politicians or bureaucrats, it wasn't anyone in office that led or were or fueled these huge victories that we've had. It was actually people. It was just regular people from the community that got together and organized, and it was led by indigenous peoples. So our win and for Red Hill came in 2022 when the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated that they're going to shut down Red Hill. Red Hill poisoned 93,000 residents here in Oahu in November of 2021. The U.S. military lied about it at first, tried to cover it up, and then admitted it, and then refused to shut down Red Hill. And that took thousands of us coming together, galvanizing and organizing and speaking up against the US military. And we were told over and over again that they will never shut down Red Hill, never. And they did. They're they're in the process of shutting Red Hill down. They've defueled the tanks. There was about 100 million gallons of fuel sitting 100 feet above our aquifer. And then in the research that we've done, we found out that they've actually spilled nearly 2 million gallons of fuel into our land and water here in Oahu. Um, some of the stuff that I was going to talk about has already been covered. 750 bases across 80 countries. The US military has contributed to thousands of environmental disasters across the globe. Um, we are fighting against the renewal of military leases in Hawaii right now. And here in Hawaii, we have some of the most polluted sites in the world. Pearl Harbor is a Superfund site and is probably the most polluted place on 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 record that the US military has polluted. Um, and I think what is important, I just want to leave you guys with some hope, but what's important is to realize that our collective power to pressure the United States and the US military um, is 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 what we need to really um, work on, you know, we need to build that collective power. I want to say that. And we also need to listen to indigenous peoples who, like myself and other many indigenous peoples out there, that speak for the land, water, and our non-human relatives. And then we also need to resist narratives that would deflate our collective consciousness, like the smallness of our islands. We are one vast Oceania here, and we are making connections and rebuilding solidarities with other indigenous peoples in Oceania, here in Hawaii. Uh, um, and it is important for indigenous peoples to lead movements because they are the ones that have that familial relationship with Mother Earth. So when indigenous peoples um, are involved, I think it becomes um, because of our familial relationship with life and with all living things in our place, it's important to incorporate that and to amplify and support indigenous movements to protect the earth and the water. I think that's it. I don't want to take up any more time, but I think the destruction, sometimes you got to ask yourself, why are they doing this? Why are they destroying things necessary for life? The US military and the US imperial machine actually needs us to be codependent on them. They need us um, to rely on them. And so the only way they can do that is by destroying everything necessary for life. So that we, no matter, I mean, right now, there's the US military is thinking about reopening the poisoned wells where, that made people sick. And they're going to do it um, by using GAC filters. And, that's going to cost money. We are paying right now. Our water bill went up. We are paying for all of the damage that the US military has done. And our aquifer, which was once the most pristine aquifer in the world, is has been tainted. It has now fuel in it and PFAS and lead and all of these other contaminants because of the US military. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of that and learning so much. We're now going to shift to Nodatoll for Korean community development and inviting Erica to the Zoom stage, who is a member of Nodatoll for Korean community development. Erica has been involved with Nodatoll's US Out of Korea campaign, which seeks to build a mass movement against US imperialism and military occupation in Korea. And recently, she has been organizing with Nodatoll to mobilize support for Yeonso Chung and other students targeted for deportation by the Trump administration.
Thanks for the introduction, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica, and I'm a member with Naruto for Korean Community Development. Naruto is an organization made up of Korean diaspora and comrades struggling for a world free of imperialism, Korea's national liberation, and for the U.S. out of Korea. Today, I will be talking about the environmental impacts of the Korean War and the US military occupation in South Korea. And after that, I will also be highlighting the latest advancements in agroecology in North Korea, which is one of just many of the ways in which they've resisted the devastating impacts of sanctions. But first, I want to provide some historical context very briefly as to how we got here in the first place. So, as we all know, Korea is still divided. It has been for over 70 years, but not by our own choice. More than 100 years ago, our ancestors resisted Japanese colonialism and successfully claimed our independence. Just days later, however, the US military arrived, drew an arbitrary line in the middle of the country, and announced military control over South Korea, or Korea south of the 38th parallel. And the US basically outlawed and extinguished the people's committees through brutal repression. And why? Well, Korea under Japanese control was perfectly acceptable to US imperialist interests, but an independent Korea posed a threat to the New World Order that was now under the control of US hegemony. And so the US waged a war against the Korean people, effectively exercising control through the reactionary right-wing comprador class of Koreans who were basically willing to throw their own people under the bus to advance their own class interests. So during this war between Korean independence fighters and the US military, the US leveled entire cities, dropped fleas infected with the bubonic plague, and deployed chemical weapons like napalm. And by the end, the US had killed an estimated 3 million Koreans, the vast majority of whom were in the north. Now, after the armistice agreement, which was meant to be a temporary ceasefire preceding peace treaty negotiations, both halves of the peninsula worked to build themselves up and reconstruct in the aftermath of such complete devastation. So, what does the southern half look like today? Well, let's start with the numbers. South Korea currently hosts the third highest number of US military bases and has over 28,000 US troops stationed there. And these bases, of course, were not built on empty, vacant lands. There were entire families, communities, and villages that existed prior to their construction. The ROK government had to forcibly and oftentimes violently expel residents from their land to make room for these bases. And so the US military effectively maintains ultimate control over all of them. So when oil leaks happen and affected people nearby, South Korean authorities cannot access them or conduct their own investigations. Oil spills can just sit there and spread for weeks on end. And yet it is the South Korean people themselves who must pay over $1 billion annually for basically the US military to occupy them. And of course, South Korea is no exception. We just heard how the people of Hawaii have to do the same thing, right? They have to basically pay for their own cleanup in terms of the pollution that's being created by another occupying presence. So in 2004, the US military gave South Korea access to some of its bases. 22 of the 23 bases had high levels of ground and water pollution. And to this day, they've refused to pay for any of the damages. In one of these bases, the South Korean government paid to remove 50,000 plus cubic meters of contaminated soil. And the carcinogen levels on this soil were revealed to be 100 times above acceptable levels. In another base, they buried 250 drums of Agent Orange. They found alarmingly high levels of heavy metals, pesticides, and other dangerous chemicals in the soil. And Korean children living nearby have abnormally high rates of leukemia. And not all findings of environmental study around US military bases are released to the public, so the true extent of pollution is unknown. But we can safely assume it is worse than we can imagine. So last year, Noruto members visited the city of Pyeongtaek, where the US forcefully absorbed over 2,000 acres of this land for their base, Camp Humphreys, which also hosts the largest US military base overseas. Our members were enraged to learn that the very edge of its borders made sure to include a stream vital to Pyeongtaek's agriculture. They were also inspired to see that on the other side, farmers had planted all the way up against the fence. Another example I want to highlight is the village of Sosongri, where the THAAD base is located. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. The US and South Korea claim this missile system is necessary to protect the people from North Korea. In reality, THAAD is a weapon of war that protects US soldiers and bases around Asia as the US prepares for its war on China. Sosongri is a farming village of under 100 people, where the average age is over 70 years old. Now, every week for the past 10 years, rain or shine, the village elders block the road to THAAD to block US military vehicles and to defend their farmland and sacred religious sites from THAAD's toxic waste and construction. Its radiation is giving them cancer. It's poisoning their crops. But yet, despite all that, these elders have nonetheless continued to protest. They withstood thousands of riot police attacks. And that's all with, of course, sustained bodily and mental harm. But they continue to resist. And where there is a history of death and destruction, there also exists a collective struggle for survival that lives on through the people's resilience and adaptability. And the people of North Korea, otherwise known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, have proven to be highly capable of overcoming the many challenges that have been thrown at them by the US and its allies. In particular, US and UN sanctions against the country make life hard for everyday North Koreans. Cut off from the world's markets, the North Korean people have learned to work collaboratively amongst themselves to adopt more sustainable farming practices and meet people's needs. In the DPRK, farmers have created alternative fertilizers, which have helped repair a lot of soil degradation caused by industrial agricultural practices. Subok Kim, a Korean peace activist from New Jersey, actually visited the DPRK multiple times from 2012 to 2015 in order to study these recent agricultural innovations. So to keep it short, he basically visited various institutions and learned that all units of North Korean society, cooperative farms, factories, businesses, universities, and more, they have rear operation teams that raise livestock and grow fresh vegetables to autonomously take care of their own food needs. And most rear operation teams have adopted closed loop production systems where they can use the products of their livestock as a raw material to create the organic fertilizer used on the crops of the very same farmlands. So they're using and reusing locally available sources. Meanwhile, the US is dumping its agricultural surplus in other countries. But as long as the Korean War continues, Koreans in the North will continue to not have access to the resources necessary to counter food insecurity in the long run, no matter their tenacity and resourcefulness. As long as Korea is still divided, there are always going to be issues in terms of the ability of the Korean people to collectively work together to survive under the devastating effects of the climate crisis, including food shortages. And Koreans in the North, especially, are going to need the support of their brothers and sisters in the South. For those of us living in the US who are part of Noruto, we see it as our duty to uplift the demands of the ongoing struggles taking place in our homeland and raise the level of opposition within the empire against US activity in Korea. So, this past summer, we launched our new campaign called US Out of Korea. Our campaign demands are getting all troops and military personnel out of the southern half, ending the US-South Korea alliance, ending all aggression against North Korea because we don't support war against half our homeland and our people, and demanding an end to the war economy. And speaking of the working people here, the fascist state that is the US is arresting and attempting to deport people en masse, including permanent residents like Yoon So-chung, who is a lawful permanent resident. Yoon So is a 21-year-old Korean American student at Columbia University who's currently facing deportation by ICE for participating in protests in solidarity with Palestine. So, if you're able, please join us this Saturday, April 12th, for an emergency town hall in New York City to help defend our students. We're calling for a volunteer town hall, which you can attend in person, as I mentioned, in New York City or on Zoom, to organize support for Yoon So-chung and other students targeted for deportation. So the link is in the chat. Please RSVP if you can. While a judge has temporarily blocked Yoon-so's arrest and deportation until her next hearing on May 20th, now is the time to organize a robust defense of Yoon-so and other students being persecuted. And our solidarity with anti-imperialist national liberation struggles everywhere, from Korea to Palestine, require us first to mobilize amongst ourselves and fight back against fascism, which is essentially colonialism turned inward, as Aimé Césaire once put it. So thank you all so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Erica. And yes, I will be at that town hall and hope to see anyone else in New York there as well. Such a critical perspective and important right now. And so now we're going to shift to the Diaspora Palante Collective. Brianna Ramos is a central committee member and co-founder of the Diaspora Palante Collective, an organization of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and in the archipelago, fighting for a free and socialist Puerto Rico. DPC is also a member of the Zone of Peace campaign, a campaign that seeks to expel all US and NATO forces from Latin America, the Caribbean, and across our Americas. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all so much for the invitation, and also thank you to the speakers. I feel like, yeah, hearing from people from Hawaii and Korea, I think we all understand the struggle against imperialism very well. It's very connected. So just briefly, I feel like most people here know, the basic history of Puerto Rico and the fact that we are a colony of the United States and have been a colony of the United States since 1898, when they also invaded Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines as well. And this kind of idea of the Monroe Doctrine, came about then, and recently we celebrated, well, not celebrated, commemorated 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine, allowing for the United States essentially to use Latin America and the Caribbean as their backyard, however they saw fit, and that includes militarization. And so in the case of Puerto Rico specifically, the islands, Puerto Rico is an archipelago, and so the islands of Vieques and Culebra were both used as military bases, essentially. So Culebra was first and was actually invaded by the United States in 1901. So very shortly after, they came to Puerto Rico, similar to how they came to Hawaii under the context of we're here to help, we are here to save you, because the Spanish-American War, as people know, was happening at that time, and they claimed that they were going to be saving us from Spanish colonization just to impose their own. And so they were in Culebra from 1901 until the 1970s. So for a very, very long time. And, essentially what they were doing was military testing, as we've talked about. And I think, a really important statistic kind of to paint the picture of what was happening was there was over 228 days out of 365 days of the year that live missiles were being shot across the island. And so the people of Culebra were essentially displaced from a certain part of their island, moved to another by the US military, and then these military practices started to take place, as well as live fire and a bunch of other things. They were also testing Agent Orange, napalm, all of the things that have been mentioned before. And then eventually they made an agreement with the government of Culebra after, having damaged and poisoned the land and the water and everything that inhabited it for the past 70 years. And then they moved to Vieques, which is the nearby island. And so they got to Vieques in 1941 and stayed in Vieques for about 60 years. And very similar things. I mean, they were, doing these ship-to-shore maneuvers, seeing how they were able to move tanks specifically in the Caribbean context, because they were doing this so that they could go to places like Cuba and help with the invasion of Cuba and attempt to overthrow the revolution. And so the terrain and the geography of the land, the weather, all of these things, that was their way of practicing being able to invade other countries in the Caribbean. And I think this is also, it's important to note that this isn't just physical warfare and militarization that's taking place. This is also psychological. Having somebody come in and take your land and tell you, you can't come to this piece because I'm actively bombing it, to go and do, their imperialist wars that they're doing. And so it's a very psychological aspect of things as well. And things began to really heat up in Vieques because there was a Puerto Rican man that was killed. His name was David Sanes Rodriguez, and he was killed accidentally by the US military, which set off a huge wave of protests. I mean, protests were previously happening before, but this was the time where people were like, okay, now we need to escalate. And so there were brigades that came from across the main island of Puerto Rico that came to Vieques, workers, students, political parties. The Puerto Rican Independence Party was very active in this movement. All of these different sectors of life that came to Vieques to actually put their bodies on the line. And so what they did was they physically tore down the gates and the fences of the US military base and put their bodies on the line, similar to what was happening in Hawaii and other places around the world where people have really resisted and put their bodies on the line in this aspect. And so, yeah, they were able to, after, you know, it was a long time of doing that. It was about 4 years of just making it unattainable for the US military to be able to do any of their practices, from protest, continuing to just put their bodies in front of this live fire. And eventually the US Navy had no choice but to leave. And so they ended up officially leaving in 2003. But as we know, that doesn't mean that the poison of the land and of the water and of everything else just disappeared. And so over a third of the people in Vieques actually have cancer. And that is a direct result of the nuclear radiation that is, you know, across the land. And a lot of the land is still uninhabitable today. And to make matters worse, because of the, you know, the fact that we are a colony, and because of the fact that we have a fiscal control board in place that controls all of our economy, what they've been doing is shutting down hospitals, schools, different infrastructure that is necessary for the life of the people. And they actually closed the hospital in Vieques after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, and they have not rebuilt the hospital since. So there is no hospital on the island of Vieques that was bombed for over 60 years. So what people have to do is take a ferry to the main island to then drive, you know, 45 minutes to an hour to get to San Juan, the capital, where all of their appointments are, which makes things very difficult because, again, most of these people are elderly people, and they're suffering from cancer because of the U.S. military. They would not have had cancer if it was not for the U.S. military being there. And so I think another important thing to mention is the use of Southern Command, which was mentioned. Puerto Rico was actually the initial like point of Southern Commands in the Caribbean and in Latin America. It eventually moved to Panama, which they were controlling Southern Command out of Panama whenever they invaded Panama and took over the canal, right? And so they have used Puerto Rico historically as a jumping pad, as a landing pad to get to other Caribbean nations and to get to other Latin American nations. And because Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, we don't have a choice but to participate in these types of, you know, trainings and different things that they have, similar to the RIMPAC trainings, because NATO is allowed. We're technically a part of NATO because we are a colony of the US. And so even in 2023, most recently, there was military trainings that were happening with Ukrainian pilots to fight in this proxy war against Russia that were being trained in our island. And so the use of Southern Command, I think, just generally is very important for us to understand better, because the way in which other Caribbean nations and other Latin American nations are being used to fight against each other, and in particular the National Guard in Puerto Rico that is trained alongside the reactionary military of Jamaica or the reactionary military of Dominican Republic to go into countries like Haiti, to go into countries like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like Cuba. This has been a continuous theme. There was actually a recent, the CIA reports that came out. The US military was poisoning sugar that was going from Cuba to the Soviet Union, and they were using Puerto Ricans to be able to make that happen. And so all of these different types of trainings that have been happening for a very long time. And Puerto Rico will always be used as the United States and by NATO as long as we remain a colony of the US, because they have complete control. There are still 5, if not other, more active military bases and institutions across the island. And Puerto Rico is a very small island. We are only 100 by 35 feet or miles, sorry, wide. And so if you can imagine, we have military bases essentially across the country, and there's not really any point for us to turn. And again, because we're a colony, we're not just dealing with US military, we're dealing with Puerto Rican National Guard, we're dealing with the FBI, we're dealing with the CIA, we're dealing with the Department of Homeland Security, who is actively removing and deporting Haitian and Dominican migrants from our region, you know, as if they have the right to be able to do that. And I think just generally on the theme of militarization, it's also important for us to understand, and this has been mentioned before, that if we're going to be environmentalists, we also need to be anti-capitalist, and we also need to be anti-imperialist, because one does not go without the other. You know, we can fight all day for the things that we're fighting for, but ultimately the reason why, as the panelists mentioned, the reason why this is happening is because they need our resources, and they need our lands, and they need our labor, and they need us to leave our land so that they can take and just take and take. And so you see the high level of displacement that are happening in all 3 of our regions, with Puerto Ricans being forced to come to the US time and time again. And so I think, you know, there's this really big issue of nonprofits, specifically in Puerto Rico, and I can say in the US as well, of these environmentalist nonprofits that are not making the connection, and they're not doing it on purpose. They're not doing it on purpose because they're getting funding from not saying these things straight up, because that's the truth. And so just really, really understanding that to fight for the environment and to fight for our land and to fight for our water is to be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, just like our ancestors were. And so, yeah, I think just wrapping up, the ways to take action ultimately are for us to all be able to join revolutionary organizations, grassroots organizations that are fighting to protect our lands and are fighting to build, in the case of Puerto Rico, we are attempting to build a working class movement that ultimately seizes power, because our current government is a corrupt US-backed government, and we're not going to be able to do anything when it comes from there. And I think apart from the militarization, there's also just the stealing of land in general because of colonization, because of imperialism. And so, we're seeing right now a lot of foreigners, a lot of tourists coming into Puerto Rico, taking the lands, having all these Airbnbs. And I know that the Hawaiian comrades can relate to this, because this is something that's happening because they feel as if they are coming into this land and making it better, and they feel like this land is theirs. And so I think that's another aspect. It's not necessarily militarization in that aspect, but it's another way of displacing people to be able to then take the land for further harm. And so, yeah, I'll leave you all with that. I really appreciate being able to speak on the panel, and we're going to continue to fight. And this is all, we're in joint struggle with one another because we have the same enemy, and that enemy is US imperialism at the end of the day, whether it be in Korea and Palestine and Hawaii and Sudan and the Congo and Haiti, wherever it finds itself. And particularly right now, we need to defend Latin America and the Caribbean, who is under constant attack by the United States, whether it be physical violence, whether it be paramilitaries, economic sanctions, all of these different things, because they're worried about the deals that China is doing with different governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our eyes are definitely on the region and ready to fight back. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think each of your examples and regions sort of highlights so much convergence of so many issues and destruction everywhere that the US deems quote unquote strategic, which is always at the expense of life in every part of it. And so I think all of them are also examples of not just what the catastrophe of the US military inflicts everywhere, but also, of course, the necessity for national liberation, decolonization, and dismantling of the war economy, which is capitalism, as the pathway to liberate the earth from empire and for life and our reciprocal relationships with the natural world. And so I just want to give, I know we're running a little short on time and a little behind, but just briefly sort of some time for each of you to sort of ask the others any question that you have. And we'll try to move through this on the slightly quicker side just to respect everyone's time, but yeah. And so, yeah, whoever wants to start off.
I just want to say I'm this is really enlightening for me. I'm just very much focused on Hawaii and Oceania, but I know this is really very much what's happening to us is happening to other peoples across the globe, and it's important. I think this is an important conversation to have because I actually can see perspectives similar to mine from South Korea and from Korea and from um, Puerto Rico. And I think that's empowering for me as an organizer and as someone who on the daily is out there taking up all various issues, and I don't even know where to start half the time. But yeah, it's very empowering, and thank you so much for that, Erica and Brianna. Mahalo.
Yeah, I can go next. Yeah, thank you to the panelists for the wealth of information that I was able to receive. It's been such an honor. In the case of Korea, there's such a backlash against Naruto's work in terms of educating people on like the day-to-day realities of life in North Korea. And even in our homeland, we have this reactionary right-wing attack that's kind of rising up as we see fascism rising everywhere, right? So I'm curious to hear from the other panelists, time permitting, about kind of their experiences dealing with a lot of these internal contradictions, a lot of this backlash from your own community members.
I
In
can
terms
go.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're okay. This is honestly something that we deal with a lot. As some of you might know, there's, this fight between Puerto Ricans that support independence and this fight between Puerto Ricans that support statehood. The statehood number is definitely a lot smaller than most people would like to believe. Most of us do support independence, and I think especially now with the current administration, people are kind of wanting that even more so. And so just trying to, I think the biggest thing is really just education. I think, just understanding that all of our people are colonized people, and that means that all of us are indoctrinated. And that takes a lot of patience and a lot of time to be able to, talk to people about, convincing them otherwise. And I think the thing that I always bring it down to is material conditions. I'm always like, yeah, you have to work like 3 jobs and you still can't really afford to pay your rent, or the price of food is really high because 90% of Puerto Rico's food is imported because, we are a colony. And so I think just bringing it back to that and really trying to do the best in terms of educating, and then also showing people there's another way. I think that sometimes people just get so stuck in the propaganda and really don't see that there's another way. And I think in the case of South Korea particularly, the fact that capitalism is like this thing that people are striving for, right? And so whenever they look at the DPRK, they're like, well, why would I be like that? That's not progress. And it's a very similar thing that's happening in Puerto Rico. And I think that it's just a matter of education, like truly education and time. And unfortunately, some people aren't going to change their minds, and that's okay. And we need to work with the people that do, to be able to move forward. And I think, like I said, just showing people that there's another option more than anything. I think people really need to see things before they believe them, unfortunately, in our society.
I think for us, there's a couple things. Red Hill really shifted the paradigm. Because when 93,000 people were poisoned by the US military on the island, and they lied about it and then tried to cover it up, people who usually would support the US military actually came out to protest them. And so there's a huge distrust. And so we're kind of like in the race right now for the lease renewals, the military lease renewals, the narrative. The US military is trying its hardest to change the narrative because they want to be seen as the heroes in this case. But so our narrative, and that's the struggle. Red Hill has actually helped our narrative, which is the truth, and so that's going on. And then we also have significant number of Hawaiians that vote for Trump. And that is again indoctrination. It is a lack of and basically, the system doesn't work for Hawaiians because as indigenous peoples, the US, the state of Hawaii and the US government actually benefits off of our oppression, and actually benefits, off of our lands and our culture, everything. We are commodified. Even our bodies are commodified. If you ever watched the Disney movie called Moana? So I think so. There is a real disconnect, I think, um, and it was purposely done. It was set up that way. Our public education system was a colonial education system. We were taught growing up here in Hawaii that we needed the military. If we didn't have it, we didn't have jobs, we didn't have money, we didn't have food, a shelter over our heads. We needed tourism. We needed all these terrible things that was really actually bad for us and our environment and our islands. And so we are a colony. Hawaii is a colony of the US. So we grew up in that. And it's very difficult to undo that because it really works. The system works. They educated us in a certain way. I didn't even learn about the overthrow of our Hawaiian kingdom until I went to college. Um, I was indoctrinated, and we were never really told the true history of our people, or what happened. So that is kind of like the challenge here, and also the fear mongering is the last thing I want to say. The fear mongering, I won't let that happen. Um, not in my space. Fear mongering is detrimental to organizing. We need to organize with hope, with love, and we need to hold each other up and create these spaces where we can organize safely, and uplift our own people and our voices. And that's the only way we're going to win this. We cannot fear monger. What if? What will happen? What will Trump do next? That's distracting, and that, I mean, I know he's the president, but it's like there's certain things you do have control over, and that is things that is within your control, is in your power. So yeah, so that those are the challenges.
Absolutely. Brianna, is there anything you want to ask or share lastly?
Just want to express my gratitude. Yeah, I think just like leaving on a note of like revolutionary optimism, knowing that we are fighting a fight that is just and we are fighting a fight that is good. And that's something that should not deter any of us, despite all of the fear tactics, all of the repression, all of that, because our people have been resisting it for hundreds of years, and there's no way that we're gonna let them down. So we have big shoes to fill.
Absolutely. You all said it all. And so I'll just close. Please follow everyone. We're gonna and keep up with everyone's incredible and really crucial and needed and urgent work right now. I'm going to send out a follow-up email for everyone who is on the Zoom and RSVP'd with all the links and information. And the recording also will have those in the description. Just some closing things for how to continue following Code Pink's work and Wars Not Green campaign. We have an Earth Month page that has all of this information. It has the letter that we put out that is trying to sort of clarify and take scope of and be such a first, it's a very like arduous baby step as like a first thing to just recognize what the crisis is and result, but part of a much longer campaign to really build an anti-militarist climate movement and make sure that any discussion of the climate crisis is accompanied by resistance to imperialism and warfare and militarism. We're going to be having another webinar next week that'll sort of be broadening about the broader dynamics of new Cold War and nuclearization, what that allows in terms of destruction, and the processes of what it is to create those weapons and their result and historic usage, but generally sort of escalation, de-escalation. We're going to be having a follow-up one on liberating Earth from empire and what an anti-militarist climate movement looks like, which we've talked about a lot throughout this conversation as well. We have a toolkit to sort of do a lot of this work locally and sort of use the letter in that way, as well as some podcasts and or radio shows and articles that you can learn more, and our Wars Not Green page that's continuously updating with sort of all of this, these linkages and resources. Please send any of that to me if you want, if you have any additions or thoughts. I want to be in constant conversation updating all of this. And thank you so much to all of the panelists and to everyone who is here. And have a great night and solidarity and US out of everywhere.